sociocultural legitimation of urban transport transformation. And I'm going to get us into this a bit sideways, not starting from urban transport, but starting from energy. I know that your network has been looking at strong sustainability in and also across several sectors, food, energy, transport. And I thought it would be a nice touch to bring up that focus during this hour as well, so that we keep in mind that transformation involves sectors having much more to do with each other in a sort of larger energy system. Some call it multi-systems. I tend to think of it as cross-sectoral coordination because that's quite empirically intuitive, I think, and descriptive of what we're seeing at this point in most of these transitions. So this is what I promised you in the short blurb. And I'm going to read that out, and I'm going to actually sort of revisit particular fragments of these sentences as we go along so that you're oriented as to where we are in the argument. Urban transport is a major arena for decarbonization through digitalization and electrification based on low carbon sources. And this is often called the twin transition, at least in Europe, digitalization and decarbonization. But decarbonization as centrally happening through low carbon electrification is particularly applicable to urban transport, I would say. It is tightly imbricated, so urban transport is tightly imbricated into infrastructures and practices of both mobility and urban planning. Mobility practices here then invoking something that's a bit more relational and processual, rather than transportation as a sector, mobility being the actual practice of an act of moving around. This webinar traverses the vast terrain implicated in urban mobility transitions to strong sustainability, crucially legitimation in the sociocultural domain. And I'll give you several examples of this vast terrain, which I want to suggest is only limited by our imagination, really, in terms of what transport studies and the question of urban transport transformation really entails, and what I'll argue it should focus on in a much broader and more inclusive way than it has tended to do in the past, with some recent changes. So let's get right into it. This part of it is the least obvious or direct for urban transport to many of you, perhaps. Decarbonization through digitalization and electrification based on low carbon sources. And I talked about the twin transition, but the reason that it's so important to be able to digitalize and not just move to low carbon sources is that as we move more and more sectors onto typically the electricity grid, because that's the easiest and most efficient way of getting low carbon energy sources down to end use, we create the need for real-time balancing across supply and demand of electricity. And that has historically just been limited to a sector at a time. Of course, transport has been electrified for a long time. If you think about electric rail, if you think about trams, which in Oslo started already in the 19th century, so they lovingly called the trick because it refers to electricity. But what is relatively new is the electrification of personal transport, whether it be cars or bicycles, and also the extent of it. So you see electrification of buses, huge demand placed on electricity and placed across sort of a complex spatiality of these vehicles moving around. What you also see there is the need to exploit the storage options that these vehicles come with in order to be able to benefit from energy flexibility solutions. So things like vehicle to grid that aren't working as much in practice as they need to. But all of that is sort of, there's a parallel to it, which is what's been happening in the electricity sector in the last few years, and it's still underway to different extents in various countries. And here you see a map of the world where you've pictured the extent of smart electricity meter penetration, and you see that really it's not happening all over the world. Africa is, pretty empty there. The US and China are quite advanced, a fair bit of Europe, especially Northern Europe. But even if you sort of zoom into one of these cases, so into the US there, you see that it's really only some states like California, Texas, Florida, there that where it's advanced quite a lot. So it's an uneven transition in the global picture. We did this paper now a few years ago, so these figures have also changed. As you see, at the time up to 2019, they had been rapidly ascending. Some of these, the last numbers were obviously not yet available in the databases that we could access globally at that time. But why look at smart electricity meters? Because it's a cognate within the electricity sector for digitalization. This is how we get down to the building level of real-time information flows. So it's a data infrastructure that's being it's being deployed. It's unfolding with a very sort of high granularity in terms of its spatiality. In Norway, for instance, 5 years ago, now even more, we reached 97% deployment to households out of the 3 million households in the country. And of course, electricity supply provision has been digitalized for large scale consumers and users, producers for much longer. So they participate in the wholesale electricity market quite often as well. But having these flows down to the very local level means that, most mornings when I walk my dog, I see that there's a sort of a housing cooperative close to me on our route to the park. And there are these smart, these chargers deployed outside it for fast charging of cars that are parked in the parking spots allocated to this cooperative. And this is set up by a company. It's not something that's owned by the cooperative. And it's such a missed opportunity because most of the day, most of the people in this housing are out. They're not using most of the grid available to the cooperative. And as we move towards, Norway has flexible tariffs for electricity. They're dynamic tariffs, so the hourly rate it varies. And people are able to, if you use some smart devices, really change the rate you're paying and optimize your consumption to minimize your bills through automation, for instance. So it doesn't necessarily work that well in practice. Depends who you are. But what it does allow for is smart charging of these kinds of vehicle bases in a way that could have made revenue for those cooperatives. Instead of the premium tariffs that people pay to charge these enormously energy-consuming vehicles, instead of those accruing to some private company that is taking over the space and monetizing it. So I think that's just an interesting example of the missed opportunities we see everywhere because thinking has not been sufficiently complex. It hasn't been attuned towards justice and towards the inclusion of various kinds of different actors in these twin transitions. But moving on to this question of why urban transport, why twin transitions matter for urban transport, I think it's worth taking stock of where we are. And with several colleagues, I was part of this paper some years ago on Beyond Automobility, question mark, where we found lock-in in a range of cities that are all characterized by, historically quite a bit of forced car dependence. Also in the infrastructures, in the urban planning trajectories of these cities. So Milton Keynes in the UK, also Birmingham, Melbourne in Australia, and Stavanger, where I lived until last summer. And we come up with three key claims here about what causes failure as these cities, which have ambitious plans for urban mobility transitions, as they try to innovate, they stay within the limits of past modes of thinking, what we call monoculturing, that these are reproduced in current modes of innovation. And we find that there's a lot of experimentation. So if you look at this table from the paper, then you see that across the board, on all of these different kinds of mobility innovations, shared mobility, more collective transport, etc., there is a lot of experimentation, but none of it, sadly, breaks with the automobility regime. So it's sort of tinkering at the edges. It's playing with little bits of the system without really challenging the forced car dependence that most people's mobility choices in these contexts continues to be characterized by. And we argue that policies must enact scalable integrated solutions with shared mobility services. Now, these could be, and they're already starting to emerge in a number of these cities, sometimes even in regions. These could be some hybrid mode of, cars that are then placed at that are available within shared mobility schemes, membership-based vehicle fleets that are actually electrified, but also used both by public and private sector enterprises, partly by citizens, things like that. So I'm not going to go into it too much, but just to kind of flag that there is an interesting literature around these things already. And then this other claim that I want to also get to quite early on, so we're sort of in the second third of that overview, if you will, that urban transport is tightly imbricated into infrastructures and practices of both mobility and urban planning. Now, here I wanted to sort of point to a couple of things. One is actually our own practices as scholars or engaged scholars. I led a project funded through JPI Climate, and that's the Joint Programming Initiative. Brings together a range of European research councils, here the Research Council of Norway, and the counterparts in the UK and Italy. And you see, on this no-fly project, the one time that we met in person was in Groningen, because the cities we were looking at and based in, which were Bergen and Stavanger in Norway, Trento in Italy, and Brighton in the UK, those aligned well with being able to meet somewhere a bit in the middle, a bit closer to the colleagues in the UK. So it took about 50 hours to make it down and back home from the Norwegian team to Groningen. Also because this is a very interesting context, a medium-sized city, like all the case cities for us, or city that's doing a lot of interesting stuff around the twin transition. And so we heard from a number of actors. We got to see some of those examples, and here we're standing in front of the pudding factory, which is where we met for a couple of days. And the rest was all monthly meetings online, and it was a very generative project, very enjoyable as well. I think there were lots of friendships formed and advanced. But I mention it because a lot of the work I've done on mobility has been through that project. It was called ROLES, Responsive Organizing for Low Emission Societies, and that continues in various forms now. But here you see a couple of images. One from our use of the power cube, which John Gaventa proposed, in around 2007, I think is the first instance. And we took that into analysis of different sectors of transport in the Norwegian cities, of smart electric meters in the Italian case, and of local solar production and local smart energy systems in the UK. All at the urban scale. And we looked at all of this in terms of social inclusion and digitalization. So here you see a number of the stakeholders across the transport sector in Stavanger sitting together, organized through the Power Cube, which looks at the forms and faces and spaces of power. So it gives us a kind of analytical tool to work with and frame some of the discussions with for municipal workers, for some of the transport operators, for decision makers. Across these sectors like spatial planning, like revenue authorities. And the other picture you see there, I think my dog's in there as well, is with a number of PhDs and postdocs walking around a neighborhood where we did transport audits. So actually navigating the city and noting, as the different groups use different modes of transport, what were the things that worked and what were the hitches that we encountered, and what mobility forms were actually favored and kind of built into the logic of the urban built environment. Just also to indicate sort of the range of ways that this can take place. The last few years in Norway, as in many other places, some places a couple of years earlier and later, I certainly noticed it also in my work in Lisbon. I know that several cities in China had this, the emergence of e-scooters, and the market making around this. So we looked in Bergen very closely at this and at what was happening as basically standards had not kept up with innovation, if you like, and companies could dump a whole lot of these things on the streets overnight, several hundred of them. And then regulation had to emerge. There had to be battles in court because basically the companies had the right to do this. The municipalities didn't want them to. And it led to interesting questions of who actually governs cities and public space, and what is the basis for that, right? And that's been a very interesting set of developments. But part of it, which relates to digitalization, is that there has been kind of digital not gatekeeping, but sort of mapping that actually sets up different zones in some of these cities, right? So there are parking spaces that are mandated in some cases, differently enforced. But also there are ideas around being able to charge the operators for having excess e-scooters available in some parts of the city, typically around the center where there's high demand, to avoid congestion, while actually incentivizing them by paying them a premium rate for keeping them available in some of the suburbs to even out the availability. And that's something you can actually do by monitoring each of these through a digital twin, right? And being able to then have an automated process of calculating who owes whom what. So that's an interesting. A company called Nivell Regulator that's been developing that tool. And one of my key claims that I'm keen to put forward here, and I'm also curious to hear your thoughts both during this hour, but also next month when we get our hands in sort of stuck into some of these issues in Copenhagen, that scholars must engage in these spaces and places. So several years ago, a bunch of colleagues at the SET Center in Bergen wrote this paper on transformative social science, talking about three modes of engagement in climate and energy solutions that we can actually practice in our academic repertoires. The first being producing and situating actionable knowledge in some of the contexts and conditions of use. The second being critically reframing discourses, so asking questions, problematizing easy assumptions. And the third being connecting actors and processes. For instance, in the ways that I just showed on the previous slide, bringing people together, structuring conversations, taking point of departure in things like power that are not always the natural focus in public planning processes for things like urban transport. And here's one example of this. We did an edited volume kind of as a surprise development along the way on this project. And as part of that, we had a workshop at the Norwegian Petroleum Museum in downtown Stavanger, and invited some artists that I've collaborated with to take sort of point of departure in the same premise as the workshop around digitization. And we focus on digitization there because it was an ethnographically oriented, a social anthropology based workshop that was saying that the kind of the empirical fact of digitization from analog to digital is something that we want to engage with along with low carbon transitions broadly, not necessarily in just one sector. But digitalization then refers to something broader than that, than digitization, than that analog to digital change, right? It also refers to the socioeconomic and political embedding of that shift and how that plays out in all these domains. So in that sense, digitalization is a broader societally embedded shift and not just something that's quite narrowly technologically defined and construed. And here you see Margrethe Brekker's work. She's a textile artist, and she did several of these technical drawings on textiles and draped them in different parts of the Petroleum Museum over these very large and impressive technological infrastructures that are often deployed several kilometers under the ocean in connection with oil and gas rigs. And it was imagining what we could be doing in terms of the technologies of the present and the future that we need to rapidly multiply. Collective transport in the form of electric buses that are low carbon, that move towards more convivial ways of navigating urban spaces and changing our practices. But also, where do they come from? What are the ways in which this mobility is imagined? And she took point of departure in the question of why she, as an artist who would never buy a Tesla, had read Elon Musk's autobiography, and in the years since, with Elon Musk having devolved into a sort of nightmarish version of itself at that point, this has become even more poignant. But why, people like her and me and you don't know the names of the top three electric bus companies in the world. One of them, actually, I see just from across my place in Oslo, is BYD, Build Your Dreams. They have a presence there in an old car workshop area of the city. And they're doing amazing things, right? And she profiled some of that here as well. And another image here is from one of the oil rigs that's built within the museum. And this is Martin Anderson, who's perhaps most famous for his work on the sun mirror that is in Rjukan. So both Margrethe and Martin run the Rjukan Solar Punk Academy in the deepest, darkest place in Norway, in a valley surrounded by mountains where the direct sunlight doesn't hit from September to March. And so he's put a sun mirror there that reflects the sunlight into the town hall square. Here he was driving over the Haukeli mountain pass towards Stavanger from Rjukan, and his old car that he'd sort of fixed up and had been using, a fossil fuel car, broke down completely. And so he took 200 kilos of spare parts and dangled them on this oil rig and called it a space for deep reflection as part of this exhibition on low carbon mobility transitions. And I think it's interesting what we take away from these kinds of interventions, because they help us to think with different points of departure than we would necessarily take as scholars or as others, right? As people who might visit the Norwegian Petroleum Museum. So this webinar, I'm going to run through a whole bunch of things that traverse this vast terrain now, implicated in urban mobility transitions to strong sustainability. So including aspects of equity, including justice, including something that's a more than low carbon shift. And part of it I'm not going to go into, but I wanted to signal is in work with a colleague and friend, Jakob Grandin. Some years ago, we looked at the European green capitals of Lisbon and Oslo, again, across multiple sectors, so across mobility, across local low carbon energy, and thought about what it means for cities to engage in this kind of shift, to symbolize it, to mobilize it, to catalyze it, etc. And the other is in work with another colleague and friend, Katinka Lundvågsæter, who I got into new municipalism with, looking at two very well-known examples of it, as Ahora Madrid and Barcelona and Como, both in Spain, and saying what happens in new municipalism when particular social movements take over local government. So in this case, they were, politically mobilized, and they actually managed to be part of running the city through the formal democratic system. And with this, thinking about this through the kind of lens of urban transitions to sustainability literature, we devised these three principles of what kind of shifts are needed in urban governance for these sorts of transitions in mobility to amount to strong sustainability, right? And one is inclusion, so a shift to inclusive, innovative decision making and policy development. Another is alignment across scales, to align policy and legislation with some sense of multi-scalar coherence. We found that the cities were quite limited in what they could actually do because a lot of the budgets were caught up at the national level. So they weren't necessarily able to implement the things that they wanted to go about in deliberative democratic ways. And the third is a shift in orientation in the underlying processes and mechanisms away from incumbency and infrastructure legacies, which I've given you some sense of for urban transport. And this was really tricky. We actually were surprised that these new municipalist movements weren't more engaged with low carbon transitions and with greening. They were quite focused on social equity, for instance, but a lot of what you would need to make the massive rapid transitions away from carbon emissions at an urban scale weren't really prioritized, or those great advances were not made in those periods. Something to keep in mind. I hope I've convinced you that this vast terrain necessarily runs through digitalization. Here I will just say three things that characterize digitalization, and that is a ubiquitous unfolding, that digitalization is happening all over the place, not equally, as you remember from that smart electricity meter rollout map, but it is really imbricated in all sorts of the built environment and in our practices related to energy and mobility and what have you. That it is digitalization is a place-based socio-material phenomenon. So context matters. And that we need to enable new forms of coordination across sectors. And this last point is, of course, sort of critical in this whole focus today. This is key that this vast terrain also runs through sustainability transition metrics across sectors. And there's a paper that came out a couple of years ago that has this little set of arrows saying that what we need, there's sort of a research agenda that I'd love for people to get funded and make prowess on, that we need to derive empirical analysis of metrology, of the science of metrics, because we have all these targets for 80% reductions in carbon emissions in transport in some city by 2030, to produce a certain amount of low carbon energy within a certain radius, to be able to do something else with the built environment and embodied energy, and all these metrics they don't talk to each other. They don't work across sectoral logics. And yet these sectors are being increasingly coupled through digitalization. So basically, we are going to run into a lot of trouble and a lot of these cities will fail and people will lose faith. And that's dangerous, right? And then you get into all questions of legitimacy and trust in authority if you aren't taken seriously for your commitments. The reason that the European Commission, the European Union's climate targets are taken very seriously is that they have a really strong track record of achieving them. So when they embrace the Fit for 55 by 2030, people know that this is likely to be something that happens. It has a strong signaling effect because of the track record. And so all of these net zero kind of targets, we need to think about not just what they mean per sector, but also what they mean in terms of how sectors need to do things together. And that's through both standards and targets, but also through how they're measured, right? So to identify pathways to first derive these, what I call cross-sectoral metrics or transformative metrics, and then to be able to institutionalize them in ways that have equitable effects. I'd love to develop a typology of these metrics for digitalizing energy systems. And I think it's a very big task. I think it needs many people. Just as an example, you see here the collective I used to live in Stavanger the last few years. To the right, you see an image from a house meeting where we had a company called Hike coming in to talk to us about how they were optimizing parking space through using digitalization, saying if you have access to a number of parking spaces, we'll develop an automated system that monitors and pushes more vehicles into these spaces for being able to charge, for instance. So they only worked with electric cars, and then also handle things like insurance so that more people could take their privately owned car and leave it for anybody else to use during hours that they weren't using it, so that cars would stop being something that occupy urban space and are used, about 10% of the time or less, and be something that get heavily used and people get remunerated in ways that make it quite attractive to facilitate this kind of shift. You can say similar things for car fleet managers, right? So that's a sort of an exponential effect. And here you have on World Parking Day some years ago, some activist researchers in Stavanger taking up a parking spot. There's a very Berlin moment, calling it the superstar of sustainable urban mobility. So on this platform that they built, they painted a bicycle golden and parked it there, taking the spot for several weeks. So there are these prefigurative politics of imagining a different world, of reimagining urban space, and actually mobilizing that sort of change, right, through our bodies and through physical interventions. Now, I promised you a whole host of urban transport issues to traverse this vast terrain, so I'm going to run through these. I won't say everything about each of them. It's more to give you just a little a map to explore, and then I hope that we have some time and some questions, and we can go back to some of them in more detail if you like. So Allemansratten and Friluftsliv are two key concepts, Norwegian and also have cognates elsewhere. Allemansratten being the right to roam, and here we have a paper fresh off the press last week that spatializes this and looks into the urban practices of city dwellers when they are um, at leisure, when they're hiking to popular nature spots. And we find enormous reliance on cars. But we also talk to people who didn't get to these places by car, and show that actually, if you don't manage to solve leisure mobility for people's relationship to nature when they live in cities, then you're not going to be able to kick reliance on cars, right? So it's very short-term thinking to optimize transport routes based on Monday to Friday, because if people then need their cars to be able to do the things they love on the weekend, then they're going to have those cars, and then having those cars impacts a number of other things in terms of mobility choices. The other one on Free Love Sleep, so it's related, it draws on the same multi-sided interviews, similar set of authors, but this one looks at the emotive aspects, the affective range that one experiences as one navigates the transport landscape for leisure mobility, and it's relating it to the kind of cognitive domain of Free Love Sleep and the space that people find themselves in mentally and emotionally when they are relating with nature as urban dwellers, and the implications this has for the transport choices, the mobility practices that people, that are deeply embedded within us as society. Moving to transport transitions and social justice, and also then to the temporal aspects of transport and urban planning. This is drawing on research with the same set of authors on these two papers in somewhat different order. I wasn't able to paste in the final version of this, but it is out there in our environment and planning F. We, to the group here, I think it's quite familiar what the justice elements of sustainability transitions are. So we worked through that for a particular urban transport transition in Bergen, looking at what's happening in a holistic sense, which groups are being recognized, whose needs are being taken into account, what are the procedural aspects of this inclusion and decision making, and what are the distributive consequences. So that's the classic triad. Of course, you could add cosmopolitanism to that when you're thinking about justice. You could deepen it further. You take a broad view there, and in turning to this one on a matter of time. There we actually go into a number of different temporalities that play out in parallel. So there's things like infrastructure time, right, where you're working with the city the way it exists, and that takes a very long time to change. Urban farm is a century-long challenge to really resolve. But some of it goes very fast. Some of it you can do through experimentation. I mean, a good example is Paris laying down its cycle lanes during the pandemic within a couple of years, right? Hundreds of kilometers of these, and some of them stick. And then it's a question of kind of medium-term change, and we look at car-free zone development in different neighborhoods in Bergen. So they did one that we studied closely, and then they wanted to have this as a template for half a dozen others in the couple of years following that. So to carve out particular more densely inhabited spaces as being car-free and reclaimed for more convivial purposes. And this is super interesting because the one that they went with was sort of a case where there was a lot of local buy-in. It was a central neighborhood, and the others, being in the suburbs, actually had very different contexts. There wasn't as much social demand for a car-free zone. People were all sort of reliant on cars and living in suburbia, and even the car sharing scheme that people could sign up to, that was also digitalized. You could just tap a card onto a car. They had much better service provision in the center than in the suburbs. So people didn't see it as a real alternative, even though during those years of the pandemic, it expanded rapidly. So they added hundreds and hundreds of cars and increased thousands of members. So, this might change going forward. But looking at the temporal aspects is key to understand what solutions are available to us when we're working within constrained timeframes, towards ambitious targets for 2030, for instance. And then moving on, social engagement and policy relevance. This is a paper that we have in review, four of us, working with dynamic evaluation as a way of trying to understand a socially equitable take on urban transport. So Stavanger ran a 6-month, a very controversial, or at least hotly debated, free public transport scheme. It was rolled out for a year. It was challenged by the political opposition, as in local election stop. It was actually implemented. They tracked the budget, and it turned out they would have funded about 8 months with what they'd set aside rather than a year. But after 6 months, the party that won the local election called it off. And we tracked this, and it was interesting because we wanted to really kind of do an ongoing, running evaluation. There was, of course, a more quantitatively oriented evaluation run by the Transport Economics Institute. And we also sort of pick up on that, which became available post fact. But it's quite frustrating. The nature of peer-reviewed research means that some of these things are really hard to have out and get into the public debate in a rigorous way. Which means that scholarship remains a bit absent in some of these debates. So there were vibrant political debates, and we pick up on that. But I wanted to flag that there are these challenges that we face as scholars in trying to do engaged research, right? While being also bound by our own set of practices internal to the academy. And then this is something that the cultural legacies as infrastructure that I wanted to place into one of these, contexts that's often not within academic spaces, or at least not within the sort of academic spaces that transport studies occupies, because this is an image from a catalog, a book that was exhibited at the Archaeological Museum in Stavanger, and where I contributed a chapter. And the book is called Eden and Everything After. So it looks at the Ice Age landscape and tries to understand the cultural and natural legacies going back 10,000 years to the Ice Age and people in caves. And the emergence of agriculture down the line. And I wanted to look at these different, very significant infrastructures available around the city in Stavanger. For instance, the county arboretum, Rogaland Arbore, it's not accessible by public transport. You can't get there without a car unless you get off a bus and walk half an hour cutting through farmers' fields. So it's not particularly inclusive for parents with toddlers. It's not inclusive for people in wheelchairs. You have a symbolic public cycle sharing stand there, but it's fascinating. It's the same with Utstein Kloster. It's one of the most historically significant places, going back to the Battle of the Formation of Norway in 872, Harald Hardfagre. That is, commemorated in the Sverd i Fjell, which is 3 swords as sculptures that are planted in the sea. Close to the city, that you can actually access by public transport. But Utstein Kloster has just to take a relatable example, they have an international performance of a Shakespeare play by a group from the UK every August. And every August, they slot it in on a Sunday at this beautiful monastery. That's only accessible by an undersea tunnel, which you can only get to by car because bus 33, which runs during the week, doesn't run there on Sundays. So it's a cultural offering of significance annually from which people are systematically cut off unless they buy into car dependence. And by pushing this, actually got the municipality to take an interest and set up a bus, but 1 week before the event, so not many people took it, and that then creates a feedback loop of, oh, people don't really care. But it's again thinking about the temporality of change in practices. You don't so also then thinking about how people access cabins. A lot of people, especially the upper middle class, have cabins. From Stavanger, they tend to go to the mountains, a couple of hours drive away. There's a lot of people going on the weekends, working typically Monday to Thursday in office and going off. And there's no bus service there other than a private company that operates briefly during the ski season, right? So thinking about ways you could set that up, ways you could set up local taxi services at fixed price in the setting so that you would avoid a lot of people driving out there. Ways we think about mobility and sustainability, deeply integrated in cabin culture and things like that. And finally, and moving more in the direction of the punchline, which is the crucial, the legitimation in the sociocultural domain, I wanted to flag this concept of double energy vulnerability, which combines a long-running policy interest in the UK and Ireland, more recently and very impactfully in Europe, in the rest of Europe, which is energy poverty, which is often thought of as domestic energy poverty, so energy services within the space of the household. But double energy vulnerability refers to this and the energy needs linked to transport services. which are, of course, something you also access and pay for from the household. And so combining transport poverty and domestic and energy poverty, you get to double energy vulnerability. And when we mapped this for a neighborhood for Ostrabydel in Stavanger, we found that actually quite a shocking percentage. We weren't doing a statistical analysis, but in our sample, the ones who stood out were students, were pensioners, and we found that there were just of the 50 or so that we talked to, in different parts of the neighborhood. So it was spatially spread out, and we tried to have something quite representative. There were over 10% of people impacted by double energy vulnerability. Right now, that's an indicative figure. You can specify. It depends also on how you define these things, what parameters you set. But this is, remember, one of the 10 richest municipalities. 5 of the 10 richest municipalities in one of the richest countries in the world, in Norway, are in and around Stavanger. So you have it there in a core urban district. And certainly it's a problem that requires more attention. And that's some of the stuff that transport studies needs to take seriously as well at the interface with other sectors. And finally, this is actually led by Devin Remme, whose master thesis won a national award in human geography for this work as well, about who benefits from sustainable mobility transition. So looking at populist resistance, looking at elite capture, looking at social inclusion, chiefly focused on the debates around the expansion of the light rail system, the Bubana in Bergen. That's actually continued to evolve in a really frustrating set of ways in the years after this. So it's a 12-year running debate, But trying to close out here and leaving a few minutes, I wanted to squarely address this, the importance of legitimation in the sociocultural domain, and to flag a couple of examples from beyond transport. With Tim Moss, who's a historian of energy and water in Berlin the last 40 years, we looked at energy flexibility solutions and how these were modulated sociopolitically over the span of a century, which is long-running work that he's been leading. And I think that there's a need for that kind of understanding around transport. And one of my favorite pieces of work on that is by for the Norwegian context is by Ulrik Eriksen, who also writes a column as a journalist around mobility in one of the national dailies. And it's called Et land på fire hjul, hvordan bilen erobret Norge. And that means a country on 4 wheels, how the car conquered Norway. And really, emerges in the 50s, 60s, and then gets on steroids in the 70s with all the way down from royal buy-in through the National Association. And so this orchestration of particular changes in the speciality of urban planning and so on. And on a more positive note, there's work we've been doing as a European network on positive energy districts, which of course tend to focus quite a lot on the built environment and questions of design, but also necessarily need to include transport. And there's this typology emerging of alpha, beta, omega positive energy districts, or PEDs, where mobility and collective transport play an increasingly important role as something we also need to decarbonize. So I think there are ways to move into the sociocultural domain across sectors and to deepen the understanding of the historical roots of some of the problems, and to try to overcome them beyond the experimentation and the tinkering around the edges that we flagged in Beyond Automobility in that paper that talks about monoculturing. Now, I promised you, and Lena reminded you of this image. This is, again, by the same textile artist, Margrethe Brekke, with whom I've co-produced some art science work. Here, this is about electric bicycles as the unsung heroes of urban transport transitions. And I thought I would read you the poem that's on there. But I would also say that with another friend and former neighbor and amazing artist, Leo Ribeiro, who's Brazilian based in Stavanger, we put the same poem to use within a comic book. It's really accessible online. It's published through the University of Stavanger's library. And we took the mantra that emerged from the Rolls project on inclusion, organizing, and commoning, which are the 3 chief things that our investigation across those cities and sectors over the years led us to. And the comic book goes into some of that and takes, it's set in the urban context of Stavanger, which I think is also really important, but it flags things like translocal connections. So here you see the mining on which a lot of our electric shift in transport relies. And just to put a number to it, one electric car, the battery takes up 380 electric bicycle equivalents of lithium. So if we're thinking about ethical, responsible, just ways of transitioning, then we certainly shouldn't be funneling lots of money and incentives into electric cars the way we've done in Norway, and what we like to boast about as one of our great success stories. There are more than 20% of electric bicycles for households in Norway. So that's, I would say, a much greater mobility, urban mobility transition, and certainly getting better in terms of infrastructure as well. So here's the poem. In hundreds of Europe's mid-sized cities like Bergen or Stavanger in Norway, public transport lacks the density to stitch together your day. Many people buy their way out by adding more cars to the road. Build us more road space, they shout, adding to the taxpayers' load. This leaves the car-free minority with buses few and far between, poor links across parts of the city, transfers that are rarely seen. Digitalization helps to some degree, cobbling together multiple modes. Trains, buses, and e-bikes can be combined to ease commuting loads. To move away from fossil fuels, these vehicles are electrifying, supported by smart charging tools. System coordinators are trying to match demand with power supply and expand transport services. The more collective vehicles ply, the lower the energy burden is. Less private car batteries also ease up pressure to mine in other nations, so transport transitions don't eat up more resources than Europe's urban rations. E-bikes turn a hilly landscape into enjoyable commuter tracks. Sustainable transport policy can shape cities where planners have our backs. That's the nice image where you see the person cycling uphill. Transport services must not end when people seek nature and leisure. An afternoon hike or beach weekend must be served in equal measure. Ambitious plans for 2030 where people walk, cycle, take the bus can only become reality if we make these choices work for us. So hopefully you see several of the glimmers of several of the things I've kind of bounced us through in there. And this is the book that they held the launch event for in Granada yesterday evening. The foreword featured the poem, but I also wanted to flag as a kind of closing comment here, and before opening up for your reflections, some desirable points of departure for the kind of interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary collaboration, as well as art-science co-production on mobility transition solutions that partly is also evident in that book. Which is available open access. So feel free to have a look at the really interesting range of chapters by various colleagues in there. The 3 points are these solutions come from working across SSH and the more technical fields that have traditionally dealt with transport, and that there is appetite among policymakers for evidence-based, critically informed reflections. And finally, that there's value in novel transdisciplinary collaborations of the sort that I've given you some examples of that enable new thinking and action. I've certainly found it very fertile ground to co-think with others on from very different points of departure. And scholars need to articulate why such an endeavor must succeed and explore how that's possible. So my question to you then is both for now and to take up during our couple of days next month. How can StrongSSH, both as a network and also for what that collective endeavor represents, how can it enable the sociocultural legitimation of urban transport transformation? Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much for a wonderful presentation. Yeah, I guess we can. So we have around 10 minutes for questions and comments, and I'll try and do my best to facilitate that. I can't see any questions in the chat, so maybe if you just raise your hands or if you have a question or something, comment. Very quiet crowd. Tulia, you want to go ahead?
Yeah, I was, it's not a comment, or not a question, it's a comment, just saying thank you to Siddarth for that really nice presentation. You sound like a book when you speak. Yeah, it was lovely to hear about your ideas, and you're very, very well articulated. So thank you.
I think, Barbara, you also have a question. You are muted, or we can't hear you. Maybe you can write it in the chat. Yeah. Otherwise, I also have maybe a combined comment or question, kind of a reflection from the context that I'm in. So I'm based at University of Copenhagen, and yeah, I also study a bit of city planning in kind of the Copenhagen context. And one of the developments that we have seen in the past, I want to say 10 years, is like a combined increase in both, I mean, bikes and private car ownership. And some studies that look into this, they actually see that it's often or sometimes there is a big overlap between the people. So there is, you spoke about cabin culture, and I think we see something very similar here, also developing quite a lot. So people, they buy bikes and they also buy these cargo bikes to carry the kids back and forth to kindergarten and daycare. So in their everyday lives, so Monday to Friday when they go to work, they use, I mean, bikes primarily. And then they also increasingly own a private car so they can go to the cabin over the weekends and in the holidays. And I'm just wondering if you have seen a similar, almost paradox in some of your work, and if you have any reflections on that.
Sure. I lived in Copenhagen several years. I did a PhD at the same university as you, and living in Oslo now reminds me very much of that city 10, 12 years ago. I think these are challenges as you have competing things going on within that same urban space, right? There's growth logics, there's pressures, demand, more people wanting to move in, but so much of it is about planning with a logic that cuts across multiple spatial scales. So if you have poor connectivity to areas where people have their weekend hobbies, or if you don't incentivize correctly within the financial systems that shape a lot of our lives and choices, then you're going to have people buy their way out of things, and kind of free ride on some of it. But I think it's also important to consider that we don't have to be against cars as a thing. We live in a society where we're deeply influenced by developments that have been layered and layered upon for decades. And the project of undoing that also takes decades. And really, the mobility successes of Copenhagen and Amsterdam and other poster childs are examples of that, right? That you start ratcheting up in the 70s and you get somewhere good. And what you brought up is a reminder that it doesn't take very much to lose some of that if you don't keep your finger on the pulse. But certainly, I think when you get away from dense urban zones, the way that space is organized in many countries makes it tricky for us to move away from cars. I think my answer to that is how do you, and we're doing a seminar on 20th November around this at the Royal Academy of Science and Letters in Oslo, that where I want people to speak about creating vibrant local community. How can you create ways of life that want to, make people want to spend more time invested in where they are and in less consumptive ways of enjoying things? So if you do that, you take away some of the drivers. I don't think we'll do it by penalizing and limiting people. There's too much money and too much sense of selfishness.
And I can see Vara posted her question. Maybe I can
The
read it
most
out
effective
loud.
points of intervention for
Yeah.
speeding up transitions. I
Yes.
don't think that there's one, right? And you rightly ask about several. It's a big question. I think when it comes to urban transport, it's about trying to show that a different system that's better in a low carbon and an equity sense is a system where we actually are better off, where people can live lives that are enjoyable, that are rich, that are meaningful, that it's not a compromise against that, and that we're living in a deeply suboptimal, deeply stuck in the rut kind of configuration when it comes to how much mental and physical space cars take up in our lives and budgets. And it's horrific. And there are lots and lots of great examples out there of people who are showing ways to do it differently and better. And thankfully, lots of actual examples of places where it works. But I think we need to not make that into a socially polarized thing of being for or against that. We need to respect that people have desires and that those desires are socially shaped, and that to shape them, resistance is usually not the most effective way. Logics that help create something that people want to be part of, they tend to run deeper and last longer and be less costly for the taxpayer as well.
Okay, I think with those. Oh, sorry, Ray. I think we have time for one final question.
One very minor comment. That was a very interesting presentation. I thought it was just interesting. I was calculating here on the back of an envelope that the fast ferry in Medström, which is also in Stavanger, that's 3,000 times an electric bike. So that's one little comment. But my question is about whether you follow the sort of social implications of the National Transport Plan or similar sorts of documents, big strategic works. In the case of the National Transport Plan, it's a 10-year document. In theory, it's released every 4 years, though, updated every 4 years. Do you have some thoughts about that? I know they have, like, the children's transport plan, which is kind of a new thing now. Some elements that may be positive, but there's a lot that is motorways and everything else, right?
Yeah, I think a great question. Thanks for that. I think one thing that's been very clear talking to various urban stakeholders about transport transitions is the enormous and very well-founded frustration they have with Statens Vegvesen, the national transport authority doing highways that are running completely counter to any claim of sustainability, any logic of sustainable urban development by flooding capacity to pump cars into cities faster than ever before in greater numbers than ever before. And it's completely inconsistent. We're used to that in Norway, of course, by talking about oil and gas expansion as being consistent with net zero futures. So it's just the same trick of, as long as you let us do whatever we want, we can tell you that it's going to be good for everyone. I think that that multi-scalar coherence that flagged in the new municipalism piece with Katinka, that's really at the core. If you want cities to do things, and the way that Norway approaches that as a policy tool is to do it through these urban growth agreements, right? Or these agreements that if you don't meet those targets that you agree upon with the city and the region, then you lose a large chunk of the federal funding to support your transport sector costs and infrastructure. And I think there should be something similar happening around these extremely consumptive, expensive to maintain type infrastructure expansions of highways that destroy nature, displace sensitive, vulnerable tracts, and that we should move towards prioritizing rail, which is almost being kicked out as something. We have 4 of the largest 10 European flown routes all within Norway. So big question, very frustrating debate. We won't solve it here. But I do think that the answer to a lot of what needs to happen in cities runs through contestation at the national level. And so it's good that we have a national election in Norway next year. It's unfortunate that there are similar predicaments everywhere. I grew up in India, and I certainly don't think that it's new that people have a desire to build lots and lots of highways and build our way out of the problem of congestion based on each one to themselves.
Okay, thank you so much, Sid, for a really nice presentation, and I think a great kickoff for the workshop in Copenhagen. And I think, I guess you stopped recording, and we'll circulate the link to everybody in the network.
Yes.
And otherwise, thank you for today, and see you in Copenhagen in 3 weeks. I think the agenda will follow very soon, probably by the end of this week.
Thanks,
Yes.
Anna and Lina. Thanks for having me. And, looking forward to seeing you guys in person.
Yeah.